Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, the US-Iran war for the Strait of Hormuz is once again at boiling point. Support for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is now banned in the UK. The UN has warned that a major massacre in Sudan could be imminent. And we speak to historian Dr. Andrew Smith about French identity, football, and the surging far right. That's, of course, ahead of the key France-Spain semi-final this evening. I'm Michael Walker, and I'm joined tonight by Barry Malone. Great to have you back on the show, Barry.
Hello, Michael Walker. How are you?
Very well. Quite heavy. I was going to start with a joke at the beginning. We actually got quite heavy topics today, so let's just go straight into it.
I don't think we can sort of do our usual banter.
Before we do get into the show, though, I will tell you this. I want to pass on a very exciting update from Pembe, our operations manager, that the build for the new studio begins in just a couple of weeks. Most of you will remember the video we dropped back in May about our plans for the move. And since then, we've been blown away by the number of you who have chosen to support us. It has been really, really incredible. And this is the most ambitious plan we've ever taken on, and it's all thanks to you that we've been able to really step things up a gear. Your support has allowed us to confidently move forward with signing agreements, creating a clear timeline, and ordering the materials we need to start the build, including air conditioning. We still got a way to go, and we'll keep you updated as much as we can. But for now, on behalf of the whole Novara team, we want to say a huge thank you for backing us at this time. And if you want to see Novara grow in the next few years and want to be part of the reason it can, then it's not too late. And why not support us by heading to novara.media/support. The US and Iran are back to fighting over, yes, you guessed it, the Strait of Hormuz. This latest escalation, though, does appear to be particularly intense and may have left the ceasefire deal the two countries agreed a month ago in permanent tatters. Washington has now launched strikes against Iran for 3 nights running, and they have continued into today. Iranian state media said there were explosions across the country's southwest, and 4 locations were also reported to have been hit in the port city of Bushehr, the location of Iran's only civilian nuclear power plant. Iran said it had launched strikes at US military facilities in Bahrain and Jordan, and that it fired on 2 vessels trying to navigate the strait. Tehran said the boats were sailing a route closer to Oman's coast than to Iran's, which it sees as a ceasefire violation because they think they should control the Strait of Hormuz, not any other country. 1 Indian crew member was killed and 8 others wounded in that strike on, or in those strikes on 2 Emirati tankers. That's from the United Arab Emirates, from their government. In the most controversial development, the most surprising development, the one that has raised the most eyebrows, US President Donald Trump did say yesterday that he intends to take control of the strait and impose a 20% toll on all cargo shipped through it. So this is what he said on Truth Social when he was announcing this toll. So he said, "The Hormuz Strait is open and will remain open, with or without Iran. We are reinstating the Iranian blockade, so named because it is only stopping Iran's ships or customers from entering or leaving. All other countries will have fair and open use of the strait. The USA will be from this point forward known as the guardian of the Hormuz Strait. But as such, and as a matter of fairness, we will be reimbursed at the rate of 20% on all cargo shipped for any and all costs necessary to do the job of providing safety and security to this very volatile section of the world." That post contradicts the US administration's existing position that tolls on international waterways are illegal. Obviously, Trump has never cared too much about international law. Trump set out his reasoning for this controversial move in the Oval Office.
They are crazy, and we're not going to put it up. Yeah, I want to be reimbursed because we're protecting a very rich portion of the world. We're spending money. And so what we've done is we are going to be reimbursed for protection. We're protecting by the countries that we're helping.
Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi responded with sarcasm on X. So he said, "POTUS is absolutely right. Whoever provides secure and safe passage of commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz should be compensated for this service. Iran has always been the guardian of the strait and will remain so forever. 20% is, of course, too much. We will be fair." So he's saying they'll undercut Donald Trump. So they will control the Strait of Hormuz, but they'll only charge, say, 10%, for example. All of this, as you would imagine, sent jitters in the oil markets. Prices today rose to about $85 a barrel. That's the highest they've been for a month. And Trump, now already, perhaps for that reason, because of those jitters, seems to have done some kind of U-turn at least. So a long Truth Social post. I'm just going to read you the key part. Based on highly productive conversations with Middle East leadership, I have decided to replace the 20% United States reimbursement fee with trade and investment deals that the various Gulf states will be making into the United States. So I suppose the idea for the US to let you use the Strait of Hormuz, which, by the way, it doesn't control yet, it's not that you'll have to pay 20% on every boat. You'll just have to, I suppose, maybe pay some sort of subscription fee, which is bungs to the Americans, investments in the US. And one would imagine that this is not just going to be sort of universal investments to the US, but investments into businesses related to Donald Trump. That would be par for the course. So Trump seems open to compromise with Gulf states. He was going to charge them 20%. Now he's not. But what about Iran? That's the relationship that really matters. Well, it hasn't sounded so far like he has much intention of getting any ceasefire deal back on track.
But we had a deal. What nobody knows, we had a deal. It was a done deal. And then they broke it. They always break it. We've had 10 deals with these people. And so we're just going to hit them very hard. And we're going to keep the strait, and we'll probably run it. We'll become the guardian of the strait. Maybe we'll call it the guardian angel of the strait. But they're a bad group of people. They've been this way for a long time. And right now they're getting their ass kicked.
That was Trump speaking to Fox News yesterday by phone. So what the hell is going on? And what might more chaos in the Strait of Hormuz mean for the global economy? I'm joined now by Sambit Bhattacharya, a professor of economics and head of Department of Economics at the University of Sussex. Thank you so much for joining me. Let's begin, I suppose, by setting the scene, because our audience will remember on the 17th of June, the US and Iran signed a memorandum of understanding, often referred to as an MOU, which was supposed to permanently end military operations on both sides. Is that now over? Are Iran and the US sort of back at war, I suppose?
Thank you for having me. I guess, the answer is yes and no at the same time. I think both sides are feeling each other out in terms of, what level of escalation they can tolerate. The Americans, they do not necessarily have, any realistic option in terms of, backing away from some sort of a peace deal or a settlement deal, be it in the short run. American intention is primarily about, navigation through the strait. Iranian intention is about a long-term peace settlement with America and also Israel and the greater Middle East. And Iranians fully understand that their bargaining chip is the strait and the control of the strait and controlling navigation through the strait. So, this is more of a power game rather than anything decisive. That said, as you said in your introduction, this can easily blow up into something which is much bigger and wider and transcend into a wider Middle Eastern conflict.
I mean, obviously this story hits the headlines when the conflict seems at a heightened state. I wonder if you could explain what's happened over the past month when we've been talking about it less. I mean, have ships just been going through the Strait of Hormuz relatively freely since that MOU was signed?
Well, I mean, the data that we have so far, it says that, when after the deal was signed, Iran allowed roughly 2 days worth of global oil supply. I think it's about sort of 200 million barrels. So that's what sort of officially went through. About 60 million barrels of that share went to India and China. So it's more of a trickle. There's some traffic going through the strait, and we do not know definitively, which ones and by how much. So, the traffic is much more limited compared to what is needed for oil supplies to be stable and oil prices to be stable in the global energy market. So, the risks are high, as I was saying, and we still don't have any definitive answer. And Trump administration is playing the game of, one day taking a much more much more hostile stance and much more belligerent stance, and the next day softening their stance. It is all about reassuring the futures market and sending a signal to the futures market that this is temporary. And I think Trump administration and President Trump himself has been quite successful in doing that. If you look at the prices, it's not sort of going sky high, $120 plus. It is hovering around sort of the $80 to $100 a barrel. And President Trump and his administration believes that this is something that he can tolerate politically.
And over the past 24 hours or so, the news has been about whether or not the US will charge a 20% toll fee, or whether they'll just demand that the Gulf states invest in the United States to let their ships go through the Strait of Hormuz, which is all a bit besides the point, isn't it? Because Trump doesn't control the Strait of Hormuz. And it doesn't seem obvious that there is any way for him to control the Strait of Hormuz. So is a kind of bizarre conversation that bears no relation to reality. Am I right in having that interpretation?
That's absolutely correct. I think, President Trump and his administration absolutely knows that they don't control the Strait of Hormuz. It is about controlling the narrative. That's what President Trump is after. And he's essentially looking for a way out with the Iranians, some sort of middle point where he can declare victory and walk away from this particular conflict/crisis. I think his statements in Truth Social about 20% fee or an investment deal with US's Middle Eastern partners, I would see them more as distraction rather than concrete policy announcement. I would read them as President Trump speaking to his electorate, in a sense that he always takes a stance of being transactional with international relations, international politics, and for that matter, domestic politics as well. So I think he's just pushing that narrative rather than anything concrete.
At the danger of sort of sounding parochial, while I've got you here as a professor of economics, how much will what happens in this conflict between Trump and the Iranians matter for our new incoming prime minister? Obviously, Andy Burnham is hoping to have some sort of positive headwinds behind him. If it were to be the case that the moment he enters Downing Street, there's some sort of fuel crisis, which gives a boost to inflation and means the Bank of England can't reduce interest rates, that's not going to be good for the guy. So how much does it matter what goes on in the Middle East right now to the health of the British economy?
It matters a lot. Energy is the lifeblood. And unfortunately, we haven't been through energy transition yet. So, fossil fuel matters a lot for the British economy and European economy. It matters much more for Britain and Europe relative to, for example, the United States. There are already stories of, shortage of natural gas, LNG, supply and reserves in Europe. So obviously, we are going through a season, summer, where energy demand, and gas demand, natural gas demand, etc., are fairly low and stable. So countries are managing temporary shortage, at a level which is not affecting the overall prices and overall inflation. But again, I'm citing the reason. If I'm not mistaken, Reuters and some of the other U.S. media reported, when the deal was signed, the primary motivation for President Trump to sign that deal was, economic and industry experts were saying that there were only about sort of 4 weeks worth of supply of crude left in the U.S. And that forced President Trump's hand. I think Europe's situation is far more precarious than the Americans. So if this crisis goes on for long, it's not getting reflected in the futures market that much, because the market still continues to believe that the crisis is temporary and Iran and US as parties would find a solution fairly soon. But it's very difficult to predict exactly when. But longer this goes on, I think the risks are much higher.
Sambit Bhattacharya, thank you so much for joining us. Really great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. We're going to, again, at the risk of being parochial, sort of talk about another British aspect to this story. The UK government has just proscribed Iran's Revolutionary Guard. As tantamount to a terrorist organisation, it's legally a bit complex, which we're going to speak about in a moment. Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper explained the decision.
Iran and Russia cannot be allowed to use different proxy organisations to threaten security and safety on Britain's streets. That is completely wrong, and that's why we've taken this action. I have felt very strongly about this, particularly around the IRGC-backed threats for a long time, and that's why I pushed for us to change the law in the UK. That's what we've done now. That process is complete, and that's why we're ready to take these steps and designate these organisations to stop them threatening the UK.
Is there any new intelligence suggesting that there isn't a fresh threat on UK soil?
Well, we've been responding to a series of cases where we have had both Iran and Russia-backed threats on UK soil, and we cannot allow the safety on British streets to be threatened. And that's why we've taken this action. We've changed the law to make that possible, and now we're taking this action to make sure that we protect the British people and British residents against these threats.
So the law change she was talking about there is because the Terrorism Act, so existing law, allows the Home Secretary to make a decision without reference to Parliament as to which groups should be designated as terrorist organisations. So Palestine Action is one of the decisions they made. However, that doesn't allow foreign state bodies to be proscribed. So hence, the law change referred to by Cooper there. So there's been a new National Security Act, which allows law enforcement to punish anyone for providing support for proscribed state-related actors. So in this case, the IRGC, so the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Barry, there's been sort of a strong lobby pushing for this. The EU have also just prescribed the IRGC. My understanding is that in the past, the decision was that it doesn't really make sense to prescribe state-related organizations as tantamount to terrorists. But what do you think of this?
I think it's absurd. And I think it's happened, as you allude to, at the behest of, let's call it what it is. This has happened at the behest of the Israeli lobby. So there are lots of pro-Israel groups in the UK who have been pushing for this for years. I know that the Board of Deputies of British Jews, which, as we know, supports the Israeli government, has made it a huge goal of its. It welcomed it today. Labour Friends of Israel welcomed it today. So we can see there the pro-Israel groups coming out and welcoming something that they've wanted to happen for a long time. I think that's at the heart of it. I think it's essentially a symbolic move, and I think it's a political move because, ultimately, this sort of near prescription, it doesn't really release many new powers for the government that they didn't already have before in terms of targeted sanctions and other levers. So I said it's absurd. I think it's absurd for two reasons. Firstly, if we examine Yvette Cooper's contention that the IRGC represents some kind of a threat to the streets of the UK, I don't think that we've seen that borne out in any way. We see all of these very fuzzy statements, right, that come from journalists and come from politicians. Let me give you a few examples. I actually wrote about this in Middle East Eye recently. Iran-linked, Iran-backed, Iran-aligned. What does that even mean? It's never explained to us exactly what that link means, exactly what the alignment means. Does it mean that it's a group who sympathizes with Iran and therefore launches an attack? Or does it mean that, they're on the phone to the supreme leader it's never explained to us what any of those terms actually mean. And yes, we had a bunch of, awful attacks, arson attacks, etc., not only in the UK, but across Europe. So look at the Hatzalah volunteer ambulance service, the Jewish community-run ambulance service. That was reported to be Iran-linked. Now, a group did come out and claim responsibility for some of those attacks. It's called the Islamic Movement of the People of the Right Hand. The thing about that group is it didn't exist before Nobody knew anything about it. Nobody knew what it was. I mean, there was even reporting in the US media, because it was also blamed for some hacking attacks over there. There was reporting in the US media where even intelligence officials were saying, don't know what this group is. But yet we're now being told that this group is aligned with the IRGC and is behind attacks in the UK and could carry out more attacks in the UK. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that, MI6 should put out a press release with all of its evidence, right? Or that they should send me an email or whatever. But what I do think is interesting is that there has been no reporting, right? So how come there's been nothing in, say, the New York Times? How come the evidence hasn't been leaked to them? How come in this country the evidence hasn't been leaked to, say, the Sunday Times or the BBC, right? Because it would seem in the government's interests to do that, right? They should leak the information, or they often leak the information to show that the decision that they're making is valid. I haven't seen any reporting like that. I do find that questionable. So for me, that's the first absurdity. The second absurdity is, how is this constructive at this moment in time? And how is this beneficial for the UK at this moment in time? Because what they've effectively done is, prescribed in this sort of symbolic political act an arm of the Iranian state, right? This is a government that's currently involved in a war with the US and with Israel. This is a government that is currently involved in negotiations about that, in negotiations about the Strait of Hormuz, in negotiations about its alleged nuclear program, which we actually know not to be much of a threat at all. And the UK decides to prescribe it right now. How is that going to make for sort of constructive engagement, to prescribe an arm of the government? It doesn't seem like a sort of a very clever tactical move for me. And I know I'm going on a lot, but can I just talk about prescription itself for a minute? So, Novara viewers and listeners are smart enough to know that just because the British government says that a group is a terrorist organization, it doesn't mean that the group is a terrorist organization. And I think if we want to look at how proscription can be politicized, or that the British government can be pushed into prescribing groups at the behest of other governments, even look at Hamas. Hamas was the armed wing of Hamas, the Al-Qassam brigades, was prescribed in the UK in 2001. But the rest of Hamas, the political arm of Hamas, was not prescribed. And that made sense, right? It made sense because Hamas is a government. In Gaza, it's a government. It's been running Gaza since 2009. It's a bureaucracy. It runs the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Social. Well, it's a government. It's a bureaucracy. It's not only an armed group. But in 2021, again, under pressure from Israel, the then Tory government, and I think Priti Patel was Home Secretary, they decided to prescribe the entirety of Hamas. Again, it's at the behest of Israel. And again, it makes no sense because Hamas is an organization that you have to talk to sometimes, that you have to do business with sometimes. So prescribing them again just makes no sense. Now let's take the Muslim Brotherhood. The large Sunni Islamist movement that was founded in Egypt, ran Egypt for a while. There's a huge push underway now to prescribe the Muslim Brotherhood. There's huge lobbying going on. At least Reform have said that they will prescribe them if they get into power. And recently, I don't know if you've seen, but there were articles in the sort of right-wing press that contended that the Muslim Brotherhood is radicalizing British university students in university. Now, who placed those stories in the British press? It was the United Arab Emirates. Who is fiercely opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood? It's the United Arab Emirates, right? And then not even to mention the political decision to prescribe Palestine Action, a group of brave young people protesting a genocide. But I guess the point that I'm pushing at here is that the prescription of the IRGC, the prescription of the political wing of Hamas, the push for prescription of the Muslim Brotherhood, it's all political. And I think what's really scary is the British government is allowing itself to be manipulated into prescribing these groups.
It's also Keir Starmer. It's not a coincidence. I think it was fast track because Keir Starmer wanted it as one of his legacies. Or did he? I did this on a fuck up about the winter fuel payment, and then everyone hated me. Oh, but I did prescribe the IRGC. Maybe that's what I'll be remembered for.
And I did get to Mexico. Oh, and I did open the pubs to watch the football.
Why does it matter? So, I mean, obviously, I completely buy your argument. This is political. Why does it matter, I suppose? So when they prescribe Palestine Action as a terrorist organization, our audience will be very familiar with the consequences of that, which was there was this organization that was doing direct actions, which many people considered a legitimate protest or a legitimate direct action against military industrial complex supporting a genocide, right? And also it meant that we had hundreds of people holding up signs saying, I support Palestine Action, I oppose genocide, or it was the other way around, wasn't it? And then getting arrested. Now, I don't imagine we're about to now see a bunch of people holding up signs saying, I support the IRGC, I oppose genocide. So who does this affect?
It could lead to people who support the IRGC being arrested. My understanding of it, again, it's not exactly the same prescription that happened with Palestine Action, but it is extremely close to it. And I think it does come with powers to arrest supporters. I mean, I agree with you. I don't think people are going to be holding placards, but it does create that power. And that is a power that can be weaponized. That could easily be weaponized. I mean, we've seen that it was weaponized against the PA activists. And it could be weaponized against pro-Iranian government people, activists, lobbyists in the UK. That could happen. So I'm saying that, we haven't seen this government, that this government is afraid to use the laws and legislation at its disposal to act politically. But also for me, the big thing is it just makes it more difficult to deal with Iran. It just makes it more difficult to negotiate with Iran. It just makes it more difficult to talk to Iran, this really, really important nation. And you're going to do this thing of prescribing the IRGC, which is a hugely important part of its state apparatus. And actually, arguably a more important part since the US-Israeli war on the country began, because so much of the sort of the state apparatus has been destroyed. And, there are some analysts who say that already, obviously massively powerful, but the IRGC has even grown in political power. So I just think like symbolically, it's an absurd thing to do.
Before we begin that story, though, I want to just let you know it will contain disturbing accounts of sexual violence and killings. Because warnings are growing from the United Nations and human rights experts that a major massacre may be imminent in Sudan. And worryingly, the situation has all the hallmarks of what happened in another city, El Fasher, in the run-up to a wave of ethnic-based slaughter there last year. Now, as many of you will know, a civil war has been ongoing in Sudan for more than 3 years, pitting the country's military-led government against a paramilitary group called the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. The war has caused what, by almost every measure, is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. More than 14 million people have been forced to flee their homes. And while figures are hard to verify, the most authoritative estimates of the number of people killed in the war range from 150,000 to as high as 400,000. Now, the fears of an impending massacre center on El Obeid, one of the biggest cities in the country, which is located in the strategically important Kordofan region. It's right now under the control of the Sudanese armed forces. So that's the sort of official government armed forces. But the RSF, which is the paramilitary, has surrounded it and is basically laying siege to the city. So El Obeid is already being bombarded by drones, and because of the siege, the prices of food and other goods have gone way up. And there are shortages of electricity and clean drinking water. Of course, that's awful enough, but the real fear is about what might happen if the RSF get inside. Here is UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, speaking in Geneva.
The signs from El Obeid are clear and unmistakable. Another human rights catastrophe is unfolding in Sudan, this time in the capital of the strategic state of North Kordofan. The international community cannot allow a repeat of the widespread atrocities that took place in Zamzam camp for displaced people and in Al Fasher in North Darfur last year. This is not a drill. It is a red alert that needs to land on the desks of heads of state and government around the world. Their phones should be running hot in the coming days and weeks with ideas on how to prevent atrocity crimes in El Obeid and in other places in Kordofan.
Turk was referring there to the massacre carried out by the RSF in the city of El Fasher after it captured or after the RSF captured it in October last year. That was an eventuality that Turk and the UN and many others had also warned about before it happened. It wasn't a surprise. It's hard to stomach the horror of what unfolded. The UN Human Rights Office documented more than 6,000 killings in just the first 3 days. Some experts think the death toll is as high as 70,000, particularly given that at least 150,000 residents of El Fasher remain unaccounted for. Indeed, there was so much killing that forensic experts from Yale University were able to see large pools of blood from space. The squares marked by Yale in this satellite image are what researchers describe as clusters of objects and red discoloration, which translates as bodies and blood. In February, the UN concluded that genocide had been committed. The reason we're going into detail about what happened in El Fasher is that the UN and others are clear in their belief that the same thing could happen now in El Abed, and clear in their belief that it didn't have to happen, and this doesn't have to happen. So our government is also right at the centre of all of this. Last month, Nathaniel Raymond, a respected human rights investigator at Yale University, who has been closely tracking the war, had this extraordinary exchange with Labour MP Sarah Champion at the Commons International Development Committee about the fact that the United Arab Emirates, a close UK ally, is the main supporter of the Rapid Support Forces.
Your work has been focusing on Sudan and the interventions that I've seen and the evidence that you've documented and shown to parliamentarians here has a lot of it's been around Al Fasher. I wonder if the changes within FCDO have helped or hindered the UK government to be able to amplify the very powerful evidence that you were presenting to them. And do you basically feel that the FCDO did as much as they could to try and stop the genocide that was going on in real time, that you were literally showing them satellite images of?
To answer the second part of your question first, ma'am, no, they did not do everything they could. The atrocity prevention team, in specific moments, specific individuals, acted, I think, honorably and in some cases heroically to attempt to do what they could within political constraints, however, that prevented the assets of the atrocity prevention team from mattering. At the end of the day, the atrocity prevention team was in a command environment on a ministerial level in which there was political capture by the risk to affecting the relationship with the United Arab Emirates that would be required to be confronted if the threat to Al Fasher was to be addressed. In short, the atrocity prevention team was a bright light in the dark sky of basically an absence of political will to deal with the strategic alliance of the RSF's main military enabler, which made the massacre in Al Fasher possible.
So to summarize, you are suggesting, or your evidence is indicating, that FCDO decided to take the relationship with the UAE over calling out the mass atrocities that you could document were going on?
100%.
Okay. Why?
Because it was easier.
Well, that's a hell of an accusation. It is true that the Foreign Office never mentioned the UAE, so the United Arab Emirates, widely documented as being the most important backer of the RSF in the run-up to genocide in El Fasher. So what about El Abed? Well, in June, Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper said this on X. We have pushed the UN Security Council to agree unanimously that the RSF assault on El Abed must stop, that civilians must be protected, and that there will be no impunity for the perpetrators of war crimes. I've met survivors of previous atrocities now camped at the Sudan border. We cannot let this happen again. So again, no mention of the UAE, only pressure on the RSF itself, which presumably the UK government has a lot less leverage over than it does over the UAE. By July the 3rd, there was the tiniest of shifts. So take a look at this clip she posted on X.
The RSF and the SAF must agree to a ceasefire for the people of Sudan. We saw the most horrendous atrocities in El Fasher. We cannot see that happen again. Those who are fueling this conflict must stop. We have seen more than a dozen countries involved in different aspects of arms flows and supports for the different warring parties. So those with influence must use it now because the violence must end.
So SAF is the Sudanese Armed Forces, they're the official Sudanese military. And you had an allusion there to a dozen countries who were sort of intervening or supporting this war going on. Again, though, no direct mention of the United Arab Emirates. Barry, I mean, so this seems like there's confidence that there is some sort of imminent massacre about to happen. What's the sort of timescale we're talking? Is this sort of the next few days, the next few weeks? Is it just something that might happen at some point?
Yeah, that is really hard to say. I mean, we don't know. We don't know for sure when that's going to happen or if it's going to happen. The RSF has been laying siege to El Obeid for about 18 months, which is around about the time that they captured El Fasher. They laid siege to it for about 18 months before they overran it and captured it. So we can't say for certain, but I would contend that if you have so many organizations, including the UN Human Rights Council, issuing more and more dramatic warnings, it would suggest that at least they believe that it might be imminent. And then I think there's also a question as to whether or not, when and if it does overrun El Obeid, will it do the same thing as it did in El Fasher? i.e., will it slaughter tens of thousands of people? There is sort of, I guess, one slight difference, which is that acts of genocide were committed. I mean, genocide was committed in El Fasher because the RSF is primarily an Arab paramilitary organization, and it tends to engage in ethnically motivated slaughter against Black African communities. It actually grew out of the Janjaweed, who many people will probably remember committed a genocide in Darfur about 20 years ago. So the RSF effectively grew out of the genocide. And actually, in fact, some RSF fighters, when they were killing people in El Fasher, said that they were finishing the job from 20 years ago. So there isn't as big a population of Black African communities in El Obeid, but that doesn't mean that they won't engage in wholesale slaughter, because, you know, they also engage in reprisals. They also attack people who they believe may have been sympathetic to the Sudanese armed forces or aligned with the Sudanese forces in some way. And, you know, we've seen this pattern when they capture towns, they go on these awful rampages of killing. I mean, look, what happened in El Fasher was a nightmare. You know, we're talking about 60 to 70,000 people, as you said, killed. There were mass killings. There was one documented incident where there were about 1,000 people, civilians, who were gathered together, I think, in a sort of a university compound. The RSF opened fire on that crowd of 1,000 people with heavy weaponry and killed about 500 of them. I remember there was a woman interviewed in Al Jazeera who said that she witnessed it and it was like a horror movie. There were also RSF fighters filming themselves on mobile phones, seemingly having a wonderful time slaughtering people. Those videos went around and they were absolutely horrific. And women were raped in huge numbers. They raped girls of 7 years old. They raped women into their 70s. They raped pregnant women. They raped people in front of their families, children in front of their mothers. And when their fathers tried to intervene, they were killed. I mean, I'm outlining all this really difficult stuff because I really want people to understand what the world stood by and allowed to happen 8 months ago when it knew it was going to happen. And I'm outlining the horror because I want to make it clear that 8 months later, we're back there and we're not seeing much of a difference in terms of how people are responding or not responding. Just to move on to the UAE thing, which is key in that, obviously, in that extraordinary clip of Nathaniel Raymond at the parliamentary committee there. The UAE is all over this. I mean, all over this. They deny it, of course, but the reporting, the documenting is absolutely clear. That's come from media organizations, but it's also come from groups that track conflict, like Nathaniel Raymond's group in Yale. And this isn't just based on sources, although there are sources who are speaking out. It's based on a satellite imagery. It's based on flight logs. It's based on vessel tracking. It's even been documented by mobile phone locations, where people have found tracked phones as they moved from, say, Ethiopia into Sudan, because we know that some arms are coming in through Ethiopia, or as they moved in other routes into Sudan with arms. They're providing them with drones. They're providing them with weapons. They're providing them with money. They've provided them with mercenaries from Colombia. That's well documented. And there are some analysts who, how key the UAE support is that there are some analysts who say that if the UAE was to decide that this is, more trouble than it's worth, and was to withdraw support from the RSF tomorrow, that the RSF could be defeated in 2 weeks. Now, I'm not trying to take sides in Sudan's war here, but both sides have committed war crimes. But the RSF have committed many, many more than the Sudanese armed forces. Again, I'm not trying to justify anything that Sudanese armed forces have done, but what I'm saying is that the RSF needs to be stopped. And so to move on to Britain's involvement, and I think why Britain is actually a really important player here. So the UK is what's called a pen holder for Sudan in the UN Security Council. So a pen holder, it's kind of like an informal designation that a Security Council member will be given to take on a sort of a case of concern, right? So Britain is the pen holder for Sudan. What that in effect means is that Britain takes responsibility for drafting resolutions, for leading debates and leading negotiations. So what Nathaniel Raymond, I think, also told the committee was that for him, that put Britain in a sort of a uniquely influential position in the run-up to what happened to El Fasher. And I think he also said that he briefed Foreign Office officials maybe a dozen times. And then the other thing that I want to sort of drop in here is that British weapons were found in the possession of the RSF in Sudan. So there were small arms target systems, engines for armored personnel carriers that were found with the Rapid Support Forces in combat zones. I think The Guardian reported that based on UN dossiers it had seen. Now, we know clearly what happened there. Britain sold the weapons to the UAE, and then the UAE gave that weapons and equipment to the RSF. Here's the really shameful part that I think a lot of people need to know about. This was also reported in The Guardian. In March of last year, the UN Security Council had information that the UAE was supplying British-made arms to the RSF. That information was passed to the British government, and a month later, the British government signed another arms deal with the UAE. So we have a situation here when we're talking about the government here, where the government here was in a pretty powerful position as pen holder on the Security Council, where the government here knows for sure that some of the arms it has sold to the UAE has ended up with a paramilitary group that has then committed acts of genocide. And now we're in a situation where the warnings are imminent, and let's look at what the British government is doing. Let's look at what Yvette Cooper is doing. As you showed there are statements about several countries or a dozen countries being involved. Yeah, there are other countries involved. Russia's involved, Turkey's involved, Egypt's involved, Iran is involved. But none of them are involved on the scale of the United Arab Emirates. It's the United Arab Emirates who are fueling this. It's the United Arab Emirates who are crucial to this. And yet, do we ever hear the United Arab Emirates mentioned? No, we don't. We didn't hear it mentioned in the run-up to El Fasher, and now we're not hearing it mentioned in the run-up to El Obeid. And I think why that's important is because there are some experts who believe that the UAE responds to public shaming. I think this is really interesting. There are some experts
it's
who
like
believe...
Dubai, right? They've got this.
Yeah,
they've got an
exactly.
international
Exactly.
sort of image. They're very focused on brand. I just want to sort of go a couple steps back in terms of the Civil War. I'm by no means an expert, but you had the overthrow of Bashar
al-Assad.
Bashar No, not
Sorry.
Bashar al-Assad. That's
Omar al-Bashir.
Omar al-Bashir. In 2019, he had the RSF kind of as his paramilitary organization and the Sudanese Armed Forces as the official military. Sort of immediately after his overthrow, the SAF and the RSF sort of ran the country in a joint fashion. And over the last 2 years or so, or 2 years ago,
3 years ago.
3 years ago, that relationship broke down and a civil war began to sort of rule the country, essentially. The SAF, supported by neighbors, Egypt, also Saudi Arabia. The RSF, supported principally, as you've been saying, by the UAE. This is partly due to sort of a conflict over access to gold, but I think more significantly, it's about sort of key ports on the Red Sea.
Spot on, yeah.
And I suppose ultimately you want one side to win in a civil war, generally, unless you're going to have some kind of peace deal. And it seems like the RSF, I mean, they're the paramilitary group. The SAF, I'm sure they're not a bunch of nice guys, but they are the official military organization. So the argument I understand that you seem to be making is if the UAE were to cut off their support for the RSF, then the SAF, the official military, would be able to reassert control over the country, and the civil war would essentially come to an end.
Yeah, well, that's what a lot of experts are saying, and it's hard not to say that would be a good thing. Again, you're right. The SAF, the military junta, which they are in effect, are not angels, but they have not been engaging in the same level of war crimes and genocide that the RSF has. And you're right, the war needs to come to an end so that Sudan and the Sudanese people politically have some kind of chance to move forward. And there was a lot of excitement when Omar al-Bashir was overthrown. And, a lot of sort of civil society groups and young people were involved in that. And they had ideas for how they wanted Sudan to develop in terms of its political system. And then all those hopes were torn up when, these two men, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo and Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the leaders of the Sudanese Armed Forces and the RSF fell out and pulled the whole country into war. The other thing is that it could split the country. Like, this could lead to Sudan being split. I interviewed the Al Jazeera correspondent in Sudan, Hibam Morgan, on my podcast, Proximities, a few weeks ago. And I asked her, is there a chance that Sudan could split? And she said, in effect, it already kind of is splitting, because the areas that the RSF controls, the RSF is sort of running governments there. There was even a report in Reuters that they've started to issue some form of currency. So, if this continues, we could see Sudan split, and initially that would be a massive disaster for the people of Sudan. And
then there'd be a kind of UAE proxy, and then a kind of Egypt-Saudi proxy.
Yeah, I guess, and you're right about the UAE. I mean, what the UAE, which, by the way, the UAE, I do want to say this: the UAE is becoming one of the most nefarious actors on the diplomatic stage. It's interfering in countries all across the Horn of Africa. Whether that's Somaliland, Somalia, Ethiopia, where it's also a key backer of the Ethiopian government, and in Sudan. It's just, the UAE is out of control right now in the Horn of Africa. And yes, they're trying to back a horse who they want to see in power in Sudan. The RSF happens to control the regions where most of the gold mines are. The UAE is, I believe, the world's biggest buyer of gold, the world's biggest consumer of gold, but it doesn't produce any gold. So it wants Sudan's
processes it
gold.
And sells
Yeah,
it.
exactly. So it wants Sudan's gold. Also, it has massive agricultural interests in Sudan. The UAE imports most of its food.
Yeah.
So it has, and then you're right, the ports, the Red Sea ports, hugely strategic, and that's going to become a huge thing in the coming years. It's already big, but I think the race for Red Sea ports is a huge motivator for people. So what I'm saying is, the UAE will have to come to some kind of a calculation that it's more trouble than it's worth, because right now, I guess they see it as a potentially lucrative result for them if the RSF wins, or at least controls a large amount of territory.
Yeah, well, it makes more sense when when we've done this story before, we have sort of brought up a map, because it does. If you look at the UAE, Qatar, these countries, they're on the Persian Gulf. They got shed loads of money, but not much space. And then you got Saudi Arabia, which is very large. Saudi Arabia sort of has one whole side of the Red Sea, and then the other side of the Red Sea is Egypt, Sudan, Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia. So, one side of the Red Sea is already taken for, the Saudis. Then the Yemenis, actually, then you've got another proxy conflict, haven't you, between Saudi Arabia and the UAE? Am I getting the sides right there? Yeah. In Yemen, and then you've got these proxy wars all the way down the side because these very small countries, obviously Saudi's not small, but the UAE, Qatar, these small countries with lots of money,
Djibouti, Somaliland,
want to protect their interests in a place that has lots of strategically located land, but not particularly sort of
I guess when I mentioned
militaries.
I guess when I mentioned Djibouti and Somaliland, what I'm saying is those are countries that can be manipulated by these big powers and can be bribed by these big powers. And what happened recently in Somaliland? Somaliland, just to remind our listeners and viewers, is a breakaway region of Somalia that Somalia does not recognize as an independent nation, but has effectively been running as one, and a pretty successful one for a long time. No country in the world had formally recognized Somalia as a state until, guess who did recently? Israel.
Oh, Israel. I thought you were going to say the UAE.
No, Israel.
When you also look at the map, you do feel like Ethiopia, no access to the sea, and Eritrea's got it all.
Oh, that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah, I don't want to say who should get that access to the sea. I think probably the borders should all stay where they are.
It's well, Ethiopia used
to go for before Eritrea broke away. Today is Bastille Day in France, and the usual military parade took place in Paris, commemorating the 1789 storming of the Bastille military fortress. That was so revolutionaries could secure gunpowder and weapons to defend themselves against a feared royal military crackdown. Of course, this evening, the French will have a new defensive fortress to overcome, that of the Spanish national football team, who have conceded only one goal in the entire World Cup so far. Don't worry, this is not going to be a segment about footballing tactics and strategy. You'd be in the wrong place for that. Especially also as by the time many of you watch this as a segment, the outcome might already be known to that game. Instead, we're looking at the politics surrounding the French football team, and there is a lot to talk about. So most obviously, in a country with a surging far right, the highest ranked team in the world does not look like the ethnically homogenous France Marine Le Pen's national rally might like to hark back to. So the majority of the squad at the World Cup come from immigrant backgrounds, with the team reflecting France's colonial history in North and West Africa. And most notably, France's captain and top goal scorer is this man, Kylian Mbappe. His dad was born in Cameroon. His mum's of Algerian descent. Mbappe, in this World Cup was subject to some pretty severe racism, though not from France's far right, but this time from a Paraguayan politician. So French prosecutors opened an investigation into Celeste Amarilla, a senator in Paraguay's parliament, who lashed out at Mbappe on Instagram after her national team, Paraguay, lost out to France. So Amarilla described Mbappe as, quote, a colonized Cameroonian desperately trying to pass himself off as French, and as, quote, a brute who had not learned to write. That's from a politician. She has been censured by the Paraguayan parliament, so Paraguay don't want to see themselves as represented by this person, has also been condemned across the political spectrum in France. So it's not as if the National Rally have said, aha, this Paraguayan politician is right, because that would be electoral suicide, presumably. Ahead of today's semi-final, though, racism is coming from closer to home. So this is really crazy, because this is when I was living in Spain, he was the prime minister, a very significant guy. So Spain's former prime minister, Mariano Rajoy, this week wrote in a newspaper column that the French World Cup team is playing without Frenchmen. It's not too long since racist tirades were thrown at leading French footballers from within France's own political elite. So at the 2006 World Cup, Jean-Marie Le Pen, so Marine Le Pen's father, the then leader of the National Front, said that France, quote, cannot recognize itself in the national side, and that, quote, maybe the coach exaggerated the proportion of players of color and should have been a bit more careful. So that's Jean-Marie Le Pen in 2006. Now, his daughter Marine is not foolish enough to make such explicit attacks against the current French national football team. Her aim has been to try and detoxify the national rally, even giving it that new name. Whether or not anyone should believe her is a different question. The far-right party, though, is not getting a free ride from Les Bleus. So in May this year, Mbappe said he was worried about what a national rally victory would mean for France. He told Vanity Fair, quote, I know what it means and what kind of consequences it can have for my country when these kinds of people take control. So with a surging far right in France, what is the significance of a successful and ethnically diverse French football team? Well, I spoke earlier to Dr. Andrew Smith, a historian of modern France at Queen Mary University.
The French men's football team has traditionally been a vehicle, a champion for a certain vision of France. Way back in 1998, when France won the World Cup, it was presented as a black, blanc, beurre. The black, white, and beurre is the kind of Verlan word for Arab, that kind of united this idea of a diverse France. And that kind of was a real vision of, a post-colonial France, a diverse France that worked. And it's often been seen as a champion for that type of diversity. And that's something that's happened quite a lot recently as well, with a number of clashes already this World Cup between various politicians, especially South American politicians, and Kylian Mbappe, of course, the kind of leader of the French team.
I wanted to ask about that clash because in 2006, I know, some of the racism towards the French team came from within French politics. So Jean-Marie Le Pen bemoaned the number of black players in 2006. I assume his daughter, Marine Le Pen, it wouldn't be stupid enough to sort of open up that debate from within her party again, or am I wrong?
Absolutely, you're right. In terms of Jean-Marie Le Pen, he talked about people being kind of, paper Frenchmen, the idea of, questioning people's citizenship. And really that was dog whistle politics about just blatant racism and the colour of people's skin. People at the time pushed back. Of course, famous players like Liliane Thuram challenged him vocally in the press, and people rallied to the side of the football team. Now, Marine Le Pen hasn't pushed anything like that, but there have been clashes with the current French team. Back in 2024, after the snap election was called, when President Macron dissolved parliament, Kylian Mbappe encouraged people not to vote for the extremes. And Jordan Bardella, who's the young second in command behind Marine Le Pen, kind of hit back at him saying that, wealthy people shouldn't tell citizens how to vote. There's a bit of back and forth there. But really, the far right in France has tried to box a little bit more clever in terms of its approach to the French national team, especially when they're winning.
And so does that mean they are, the National Front are sort of trying to rally around the flag, and I suppose they want to be associated with the French team. I'm not sure if the French team want to be associated with them.
Yeah, 100%. I think we've seen before already, back in 2024, as I said, you got Mbappe kind of criticising people voting for the extremes. There were other players at the time, like Marcus Thuram came out, echoing those thoughts as well. They really paint themselves, the football team present themselves as being kind of a winning mentality, They see themselves as facing off against all comers. There was a storm already in terms of the former Spanish Prime Minister criticised them again, questioning, much like Jean-Marie Le Pen did way back in 2006, the nationality of some of these players, whether or not they're really French and all the rest of it. But unanimously, right across the French political spectrum, people have hit back at it, calling it racism, just saying this is not an acceptable thing to talk about in this moment. So I think, the French political spectrum is all for the French national team. There was a bit of doubt beforehand, before the tournament started. Mbappe was seen as being a little bit overconfident, maybe he'd gone on a bit of a dry spell, all this kind of stuff. But there was a huge petition, essentially, a signed open letter from French people apologising to Mbappe for his, for lacking confidence in him beforehand, an apology to the captain, an encouragement to drive him forward.
I know you're a historian, you're not a football analyst, but you are sort of a close follower of France, I suppose, and a football fan as well. So, lots of people are asking, why does France so consistently produce sort of incredible world-class footballers? Because it's not just the French team at this World Cup. I think there's almost 100 players at this World Cup who were born in France. So obviously there's lots of people in France who have a background in a different country. FIFA, their rules means that you can sort of play for any team if your grandparent was from there. So there are some people who can choose 4 teams who they play for. And many people who were born in France have now gone on to play for, the country of their mother or father or whatever. What is it about France that means that they just pump out these incredible footballers?
I think there's a lot of consistent state support for grassroots football, an encouragement of trying to draw them in to the football system from a young age. You've got elite clubs, like rich clubs like PSG, of course, but a good standard throughout Ligue 1 as well. Football is one of these games that is, often played by, younger, poorer men, boys that are grown up in neighborhoods in the banlieue, as it gets called in France. The idea of the quartier populaire, working class areas of cities, where people are playing their way out. They're trying to get ahead. They're pushing for something which, they can excel in by their own talent, not held back by, social structures of racism, like the disadvantage that affects them in various other ways. So really, I think one of the things we can see is that the concentration of people trying to kind of push their way to better their station is one of the reasons that, this diverse country of France, it's a huge post-colonial nation. The French Empire, of course, was absolutely vast, slightly different from the British Empire, and a lot of places were legitimately considered to be part of France, of course, like Algeria right up until 1962. But even now, France has copious sort of overseas territories, these crumbs of empire scattered throughout the Pacific Ocean, throughout the kind of Indian Ocean, places where there are still overseas departments, overseas regions. So I think really, why does France produce these players? It's because of the systems that supports better footballers, communities of working class kids trying to play their way into the kind of, into fortune, basically, but also these post-colonial legacies where France is still marked by those legacies of empire. And, it really is a post-colonial nation that needs to reckon with those types of kind of social attitudes, I think.
And just because I know some of our audience's ears might have pricked up when you sort of said, we're legitimately considered part of France. I suppose you want to just expand by what you mean by that. Sort of, I suppose
it was considered territorially part of France. If you imagine, the idea of the Mediterranean was considered at the time as like the two banks of the Seine, So Algeria was divided into 3 départements. They were considered French territory. It was not a separate country which was owned by France, but it was viewed by the French state as being part of France. So legitimately, considered by law. It was, of course, part of the reason for the brutality of Algeria's war for independence stemmed from the fact that it was considered not a war, but an internal policing action by the French state, which led to some of the real brutality, the use of torture, the extraordinary crimes that Emmanuel Macron acknowledged were committed during that war. So that's what I mean, really that kind of odd territorial legacy of its entanglement with France.
I mean, I was watching YouTube videos about sort of why France creates such good footballers today. And there was a clip of Thierry Henry sort of saying that it's a bit like sort of music, in the sense that sort of if you're from a working class area, which is often sort of majority ethnic minority, and there aren't many avenues for you to advance in sort of business or politics or whatever, then the 2 routes out are football or music. And that's why, sort of, in his words, sort of so many people have gone on to become brilliant footballers from France's banlieues. And I mean, there's a way in which that potentially suggests that actually this isn't necessarily the most positive story in the world, because France does seem to, sort of compared to Britain, have much lower social mobility when it comes to ethnic minorities into politics, into the sort of higher levels of business. So is potentially, in an odd way, the success of the French football team in part because of the ghettoization of working class immigrant communities in France?
It's an interesting point. So remember, the French system is, the French Republic is universalist rather than multicultural. What that means is that as a function of, the legacy of the revolution, the attempt to look at, equality and fraternity, the idea is the French state doesn't see colour or race. It sees French citizens. And so the French state is technically blind to colour, blind to religion, all of these kind of things. Now, actually, what that does often is conceal much larger social inequalities. So you get people, talk about laïcité, this idea that you don't have a state religion. Now, someone wearing a headscarf is much more likely to hear about ideas of laïcité than someone who's a nun, for example. What does that say? It says there are lingering kind of social attitudes where actually this is a really negative thing. We can see that already. There are various surveys that talk about how, for example, having a name which might come from North Africa sets you back in terms of job applications. There's very little positive discrimination or ideas of that type of equality legislation that comes in the same way in terms of monitoring different shares of people. And that can lead to some very, very bad outcomes. So yeah, there has been various kind of attempts to challenge this. You go right back into history from 1983, the Marche pour l'égalité contre le racisme, the Marche des Beurs, it was called, which was really about kind of kids and community groups from Lyon challenging the idea of the French state's racism, pushing against it. You've seen various kind of movements between that, SOS Racisme, which became sort of institutionalized perhaps. Then other groups like Indigènes de la République, which challenge this idea and say that people are mistreated within the idea of the state, treated as if they're put on reserves, and that idea of ghettoization, as you spoke about. So there's really a kind of a long history of anti-racism in France, which has a lot of work to do and continues to push back against some quite negative social attitudes. Some of those can get disguised by the idea that the headline of universalism. But in reality, I think there are still a lot of problems still to come. And you're right, the idea of that dominance of the football team is in some ways a great story, a wonderful story for 14 Juillet, for Bastille Day. But it's also something which speaks to that being the only route out for some people, for kids that really don't have those other options that many of their peers would if they grew up called something like François in a nice bit of Paris, for example, rather than the banlieue.
Finally, just looping back to sort of politics without the football, is Marine Le Pen, obviously she's just been sort of quite recently been given the right to run in the election, although she's going to have a tag on her ankle. Is she still the favourite to become French president next year?
Yes, the convict candidate. She is still in the leading place in terms of all the opinion polls. But actually, one of the things that people were saying in the run-up to her sentence being reduced on appeal was that in many opinion polls, it was seen that Bardella was perhaps the stronger candidate for the National Rally. He's younger, he's seen as less tarred by that name. Marine Le Pen has, of course, there's this language of detoxification. I think it's really important to state that's not analysis. That's been a deliberate comm strategy by the National Rally to try and detoxify themselves. So they've tried to kind of remove all those old kind of associations with Jean-Marie Le Pen, but the name is still there. There's still that association that you scrape beneath the surface and you're really getting back to the kind of old style kind of far-right, racist, fascist organizations just beneath the surface. So there is a lot there to do. And one of the things that Marine Le Pen's trying to do is she's trying to keep Bardella right next to her at every single rally, at every single thing. Now, she will push. She leads right now. But I think one of the things to point out is that with the opinion polls, we're still a long way out. It'll be April, then May for the second round. And it is not clear who many of the other candidates will be. So especially in polling at this stage, the National Rally has a slight advantage because there is more clarity about who the candidate will be. And so that means there's more name recognition from the public. But that can create momentum. And it's important to challenge that as well and say there is still a lot of race yet to be run. September is going to be very interesting for French politics, and we start to get much more clarity about who the opponents will be in the actual presidential race.
That was Dr. Andrew Smith speaking to me earlier today. And we'll let you get off now to watch France versus Spain in an hour or so, if that is your thing. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.